Hello and welcome as we continue discussing the linking of tasks. Earlier on, we changed the mode of scheduling from manual to automatic in this second column. We said that when a task is manually scheduled, we have to indicate the duration and start date of that task. If anything should change on the overall program, we also need to manually change the start and end dates of each manually scheduled task. Let's take, for example, this task for fitting the ceiling. It is a 2-day task that is starting on Wednesday, the 13th of January. If this was manual scheduling and we increased the duration to 3 days, then this bar would stretch up to here. Then the following tasks would then have to be moved manually to the next working day. The importance of linking tasks, like we've just done, is that with automatic scheduling, the system will automatically reschedule all the subsequent or successor tasks the moment we change the duration of this task. So let us change it to 3 days by just typing in 3D, and let's see what happens. So immediately the task increases to 3 days and then pushes the following set of tasks to the next working day, because these two are a weekend, a Saturday and a Sunday. So whatever changes we make, if I take it down to 1 day, it will readjust the rest of the program because these tasks are automatically scheduled. If there was no link between these tasks, changing the fitting of the ceiling would not affect the rest of these tasks. The only reason they are being affected is because they are linked. So let's take it back to 3 days. Now I would like to discuss the other types of relationships, type of links, besides the finish to start relationship. So the finish to start relationship says the next task, which is the successor task, only starts when the predecessor is finished. That is a finish to start. Then we have another type of relationship, which is a start to start relationship. So the start to start relationship says the start date of the predecessor. The start date determines the start date of the successor task. So in other words, we are no longer dealing with the end date of the predecessor, but we are dealing with the start date. So in other words, the start of this activity must also trigger the start of the next activity. For example, if we go to the very top of our program, first we draw the plan, then next we buy materials, and then dig the foundation. But then we do not need to finish buying the materials before we start digging the foundation. So it means that the relationship between the buying of materials and digging of foundation doesn't necessarily have to be a finish to start relationship. We can actually say the day that we start with the purchasing of the material is also the same day that we start with the digging of the foundation. So for us to change the type of relationship so that it becomes a start to start relationship, we go to task number 3, then we go to task and information. So it's the task tab, and then you look for information on the properties, and then you click on information, and it brings this task information. In one of the earlier modules, I indicated that there's a shortcut of coming to this task information by simply going to that task and you double click on it. So by double clicking on the task, it is the same as going to the task tab, looking for information, and it opens the task information page. Then we look for predecessors. So click on the tab for predecessors, and it shows that the predecessor is the buying of materials, and the type of relationship is finish to start. So this is where you can click on the down arrow and select start to start. So we basically can switch to any type of relationship in this column. So for now, we would like to change it to a start to start. So meaning that the start of one triggers the start of the other. And we say, okay. So you can see now that the start of this activity, the start, is now linked to the start of the next activity. So what we could do is we can now change the start date of this activity and say, although it's linked to the start of this activity, does it necessarily start on exactly the same date, or it can start a day later? Because the start to start relationship does not necessarily say they must start at the same time. It simply says the start of the predecessor triggers the start of the successor. So we can change the start date of our successor, which is number 3, and let's make it start, say, the same day as the predecessor. So we make it to start on the 14th. So now it is starting on the 14th. So whichever day you select, if you make it 15, it starts a day later. But otherwise, this activity could never start before the start date of the predecessor. So if for argument's sake, we decided, let us make activity number 3 to start on the 12th. You click on the 12th, it will automatically switch it back to 14. Why? Because its start depends on the start of the predecessor. The next relationship is called a finish to finish relationship. So in the finish to finish relationship, the finish date of the predecessor task determines the finish date of the successor task. In other words, it is saying you cannot finish this activity before this one is done. So this is usually important where the output of this activity is required in the processing of the next activity. So in other words, there is no way that the successor could be finished before we finish the previous task. Okay, let me check and see if there is an example we can give here. Although it is not an ideal example, if we take the fitting of electrical pipes and the fitting of lights or the fitting of plug sockets, we can only complete the fitting of the sockets after the pipes are completed. Why? Because we only fit the sockets once the wires are already in the pipes. So in other words, we want to force the system to ensure that the completion date for fitting of sockets can never be earlier than the completion date for the fitting of electrical pipes. So in that case, what you could do is go to this activity, which is the plugs, double click to get the task information, then go to the type of the link to change to a finish to finish. However, our predecessor is number 17, which is the fitting of the ceiling. So for the sake of the example, we'll just leave it like that and say okay, so we can see how it comes out. So now you can see that the relationship between these two tasks is now a finish to finish. But the relationship between this task and the next, it's still a finish to start relationship. So this is basically how we change the dependencies between the various tasks. Then lastly, we have got the relationship start to finish. So a start to finish relationship says the start date of the predecessor task determines the finish date of the successor task. The start to finish relationship basically says if two tasks are coming one after the other, let me get any two tasks. Let's say, for example, this task number 5 and task number 6. So start to finish says the finish date of the latter activity, in other words the next activity, the finish date cannot happen before the start date of this activity. In other words, you must only finish this activity when that activity has started. So this is different from a finish to start, because the finish to start says this activity must be finished first before we start this one. But the reverse is true for the start to finish, because it says that this activity cannot finish, right? So it's not depending on the finishing of that one. What we are concerned about is the finishing of this activity. So in other words, the condition is on the completion of this activity, not on its start. It's on its completion. So we say it cannot complete until this activity has started. It's a bit confusing, but if you take some time to think about it, you'll see that the relationship between the tasks is either based on the beginning, the start of the successor, or on the completion of the successor. So if it is based on the start, we will say this task cannot start until this one is finished, because the condition is based on the start of this activity. But now we have changed it, and we have said the condition is not based on the starting of this activity, but on the finishing of this activity. So we say this activity cannot finish before this activity starts. So it becomes a start to finish relationship. So the reason why we start with the start and we end with the finish is because the predecessor is the one that is the start condition. The successor has got the finish condition. That's why we call it a start to finish. So this activity must start first before this one can be completed. When you look at a schedule like this one, it might be difficult to understand, okay, this one is short and it's coming after this one, so why should we talk about this activity finishing after this one is started? Let me change the length of this activity, then you will understand better. But first, let us change the rule here by double clicking, and then we change the rule to start to finish. Right. So now you can see that the start of this previous activity is now linked to the finishing. So when you link start to finish, the scheduling is worked backwards, right? It's worked backwards. So in other words, we determine and we say the start date for this activity is Saturday the 31st. Then the next activity must finish after this one has started. So in other words, it should have started earlier in order for it to finish when this one is starting. So that is why it moves this activity backwards. So even if we increased the activities days here, say to 3 days, 3D, it extends it backwards. Why? Because the end date is determined by the start of this activity here. So the longer we make this task, the earlier it must start, so that it must finish by the time this other activity is starting. So that is the difference between the finish to start, because with finish to start, if you increase the length of this activity, it pushes all the ones that are following to the right, because they must only start when this one has finished. So if we increase this one by 1 day, it pushes everybody else to the right by 1. But if it is a start to finish relationship, when we increase the duration of the successor activity, it does not change the finish date. It simply changes the start date so that it finishes on the same date, because its finishing is fixed and conditional upon the start of the predecessor. All right, so that was quite a mouthful. I hope you will understand it better through practicing, because the more you do it practically, the more you understand it. So I would like you to work on your relationships and see if you can play around with relationships between different tasks. You do the finish to start, you do the start to start, you do the finish to finish, you do the start to finish. And don't forget to save your work once you have worked on your relationships, because I'll be needing you to submit your progress report, which is a copy of your project plan at this particular stage after you have finished manipulating the task relationships. So I'll see you in the next module.